10 years ago, Julia Carson walked out the front door to buy groceries for her family's dinner and never returned home. Her car, keys, wallet, and phone all disappeared alongside her, leaving her husband and 3 children in a state of agonizing limbo. Police investigations focused initially on her marriage, but with no history of conflict and her husband's solid alibi, the case eventually went cold, becoming just another tragic mystery in their small town's history. The Carson family was left shattered, forced to rebuild their lives around an empty space where a wife and mother should have been. Dan, now dependent on a cane after a severe accident 2 years before his wife's disappearance, found himself adrift without Julia's steadying presence. Their children, Ethan, Mark, and Ellie, grew up under the shadow of uncertainty, each anniversary passing without answers. As they sat in their living room, marking another painful year without her, Ellie finally voiced what they were all thinking. "I just wish we knew why she left." Dan opened his mouth, but words failed him, as always. Just then, headlights swept across the room, and Ethan burst through the front door, his expression urgent and breathless. "Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today." Ethan stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. He had Julia's determined gaze, a painful reminder of the strength they'd lost. His eyes darted nervously around the room, sensing the heavy silence. Ellie moved first, gently helping Dan rise from his seat. It was Sunday, family dinner night, a tradition they desperately clung to after Julia vanished. But without her, these dinners had become hollow, the empty chair at the table a constant reminder of their loss. "I know I'm late," Ethan started, his voice strained, apologetic. "I got a call from Detective Harper." Dan's posture stiffened at the detective's name. Over the years, they'd chased countless leads, each ending in bitter disappointment. Ellie set plates mechanically, her movements precise, almost robotic. At 19, she'd become the household manager by default, quietly shouldering the burdens Julia once carried effortlessly. The chicken casserole, a poor imitation of Julia's recipe, sat cooling on the counter. No one had the heart to mention how it never tasted quite right. Dan watched his daughter, guilt churning within him. The man who'd once run marathons now depended on a cane and his children's strength. Julia's disappearance had broken more than his body. It fractured his spirit, leaving him silently grieving the life they'd planned. "What is it this time?" Ellie finally asked, her voice gentle yet cautious, afraid to hope again. Ethan hesitated, torn between protecting them from more pain and the urgency pressing at his chest. He thought of the many disappointments they'd endured, the reported sightings that led nowhere, the psychic who claimed Julia was living in Florida, the neighbor who swore he saw her at a gas station 3 states away. "It's different," he finally whispered. "They found her car, in Harper's Woods." Ellie's hand froze mid-air, a dinner plate suspended between table and silence. Harper's Woods, she recognized the name instantly. It was remote, tangled with rumors, a place mothers warned their children to avoid. Dan sank slowly back into his chair, gripping his cane as if the floor might vanish beneath him. He stared at Ethan, disbelief etched into his worn features. "Her car, after all this time?" Ethan nodded solemnly, pulling a chair beside his father. They found it buried under branches and debris. Someone deliberately hid it there. They're certain it wasn't an accident. A chill crept through the room, as if Julia's absence had grown more tangible, darker. Ellie trembled, suddenly remembering childhood nightmares, whispered conversations she wasn't supposed to overhear, the haunting emptiness of waking up each day without answers. "Why would her car be there?" Ellie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Memories flooded through her. Summer picnics at Harper's Woods, Julia spreading a checkered blanket under the oak trees, teaching them the names of wildflowers. That place had been special to their mother. Before. Ethan hesitated, carefully weighing each word. They found something else. A necklace she always wore. And a note saying, "Forgive me. I did it to protect you." Dan's breathing grew ragged, memories overwhelming him. Julia's anxious glances at unpaid bills, hushed phone calls she'd ended abruptly when he walked in. He'd sensed something wrong, something she was hiding, but he'd been too afraid to confront her. What did she mean by protect us? Ellie's voice quivered, seeking answers Ethan didn't yet have. Before Ethan could respond, his phone vibrated sharply. He stared at the caller ID, eyes widening. "It's Detective Harper again," Ethan murmured, turning pale. "They've discovered something else in the car." Ethan stepped onto the porch to take the call. The chill in the air didn't bother him. His blood was already running cold. Inside, Dan and Ellie sat frozen, waiting. From where he stood, Ethan could see them through the window, his sister absently straightening forks that were already aligned, his father staring at his hands as if they held some long-lost answer. When Ethan returned, his face had changed. The determined hope had been replaced by something harder, colder. "They found fingerprints," he said quietly, shutting the door behind him. "Not just Mom's, someone else's, a man's." Dan looked up sharply. Ellie's eyes widened. "A man?" she asked. "Like someone she was with?" The unspoken accusation hung in the air. For years they'd battled the whispers that Julia had simply left, found someone else, started a new life without them. It was easier for strangers to believe that than to face the alternative. "I don't know," Ethan said, pacing now. "But it wasn't some random stranger. The prints matched a known name, a man tied to a string of shady loan operations. His name's Victor Lorne." Dan blinked hard. The name meant nothing to him. But Ethan continued, voice strained with urgency. "Detective Harper thinks Mom may have borrowed money from this guy. During the worst of our financial collapse after your accident, Dad. It's possible she got trapped." "You mean like threatened?" Ellie whispered. Ethan nodded. "Or worse." Dan pressed a trembling hand to his temple. The medical bills after his accident had been crushing. Insurance covered only a fraction, and his rehabilitation had stretched their savings to breaking. But Julia had somehow kept them afloat, paid the mortgage, kept food on the table. He'd been too consumed by his own recovery to question how. "Why didn't she tell me? We could have faced it together." "She probably didn't want to add more weight," Ethan said, his voice softening. "She always carried too much." They sat silently, each trapped in their own thoughts, their own guilt. Outside, the evening had deepened into night, stars emerging like distant memories. Ellie suddenly stood. "We need to go there. To the woods. To the car. I want to see it for myself." Ethan nodded. "That's why I came. Detective Harper said we could be there in an hour." Dan tried to rise, but winced. The long day had aggravated his old injuries. "I'll slow you down." "No," Ellie said gently. "You need to rest. We'll bring you answers." She kissed his forehead, a gesture so like her mother's that Dan had to look away. Harper's Woods was darker than Ellie expected. Even in daylight, the towering trees leaned inward, their branches tangled like secrets that never reached the light. As Ethan parked near the police tape, a uniformed officer waved them through. Detective Harper stood by the edge of a muddy slope, his face unreadable. "She used to bring us here for picnics," Ellie whispered, her breath fogging the window. "It feels different now." "Yeah," Ethan said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Everything does." They stepped out into the damp earth, the smell of moss and decay heavy in the air. Just below the slope, half buried beneath years of leaves and time, was a rusted silver sedan, Julia's car. The one she'd driven to the grocery store 10 years ago, promising to be back before dinner. Detective Harper met them halfway down the incline. He looked older than Ethan remembered, more lines around his eyes, grey threading through his dark hair. For 10 years he'd carried their mother's case, refusing to let it grow cold. "We believe it was pushed here on purpose. There's no sign of impact. Tires were slashed, and the interior was stripped of anything traceable except the necklace and the note." The detective handed them each a pair of gloves. "You can approach the vehicle if you want. Just don't touch anything we haven't cleared." "Did you find her?" Ellie asked quietly. Harper hesitated. "No, and that's the part that doesn't fit. If this was staged to look like a disappearance, why leave behind the note?" He handed Ethan a small plastic bag. Inside was the necklace, Julia's. The silver pendant with a small sapphire that matched her eyes. The one she wore every day, right over her heart. "She wouldn't leave this unless someone made her," Ellie said, voice cracking. The necklace had been Dan's gift on their 10th anniversary. Julia had claimed it was too beautiful for everyday wear, but she'd never taken it off. Ethan stared at the trinket, his pulse racing. Then maybe she's not gone. Maybe she never meant to leave at all. Harper gave a cautious nod. If that's true, then someone made sure she couldn't come back. Ellie moved closer to the car, peering through the gloom at what remained of their mother's life. The seats were faded, covered in a decade's worth of grime and mould. The steering wheel still bore the imprint of Julia's hands. "Can we see the note?" she asked quietly. Harper hesitated, then produced another evidence bag. Inside was a slip of paper, the handwriting unmistakably their mother's, slightly slanted, letters pressed hard into the page as if written in haste or fear. "Forgive me. I did it to protect you." 7 words. After 10 years of silence, just 7 words. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Back at home, he spread everything across the dining table, photos of the car, the necklace, the note, and a printout Detective Harper had quietly slipped into his hands before they left the woods. It was a payment ledger. Julia's name appeared twice. The dates matched the final months before she vanished. She had borrowed $25,000 from a shell company linked to Victor Lawn. Ethan's heart pounded. Dan had been in the hospital then, fighting to regain his mobility after the accident. The medical bills had mounted daily, and their insurance had reached its limit. Julia had somehow managed to keep them afloat, even as their savings dwindled to nothing. Attached to the ledger was a blurry photocopy of a contract signed J. Carson. But what stood out was a second signature, one that didn't belong to Victor. Ronald Lawn, the brother, the one no one ever talks about. A man with no online footprint, but known to law enforcement for one thing: making people disappear for a price. Ethan stared at the final note on the file, scribbled in Harper's handwriting. If she wanted to protect them, she'd disappear herself before they came knocking. Ellie entered the room in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Can't sleep either." He nodded. "They didn't just find Mom's car, Elle. They found her reason." He showed her the ledger, the signatures, the detective's note. Ellie's fingers traced their mother's handwriting, tears gathering silently. $25,000, she whispered. "That was the exact amount of Dad's hospital bill, the one that wasn't covered." Ellie sat beside him quietly. For a long moment, neither spoke. "She was trying to save us," Ellie whispered. "She still might be," Ethan replied, "and I'm going to find out." 3 days later, they gathered in Detective Harper's office. Dan sat stiffly in a chair, his cane propped against the desk. Ellie perched beside him, while Ethan paced by the window. Harper entered with a thick file and a grim expression. "We've confirmed a pattern," he said without preamble. Victor Lawn's operation targeted vulnerable families, specifically those with medical debt. They offered immediate cash, reasonable terms, at first. He opened the file, spreading photographs across the desk. "These are 5 other women who disappeared between 2010 and 2015. All had borrowed money from Lawn's shell companies. All vanished without a trace." Ellie's hand covered her mouth. "Were they killed?" Harper shook his head slowly. "We don't think so, at least not all of them. Based on our investigation, Lawn's operation had a more sophisticated approach. When borrowers couldn't pay, they were given a choice: disappear and work off the debt, or watch their families suffer the consequences." "Work how?" Dan asked, his voice hollow. "Identity fraud, money laundering, document forgery. Lawn ran an extensive network that needed people with clean records and a strong motivation to stay hidden." "And you think Mom chose to disappear, to protect us?" Ethan said quietly. Harper nodded. "The note confirms it. And there's more. 3 days before Julia vanished, your house had an unexpected visitor. A man matching Ronald Lawn's description was seen talking to her on your porch." Dan closed his eyes, remembering. "She said it was someone from the hospital billing department." "It was the trigger," Harper continued. "Based on our investigation of similar cases, Lawn likely gave her an ultimatum that day: disappear and work for them, or they'd hurt her family. "So she's been alive all this time?" Ellie asked, hope threading through her voice. "We believe so, and now we might have a chance to find her." Harper pulled out one last document. "Based on financial records we've tracked, Lorne's operation collapsed 3 months ago. His assets were seized, his network exposed. If Julia was part of that network, then she might be free," Ethan finished, his heart racing. "Or trying to find her way home," Harper said quietly. The next morning, Ethan met with Detective Harper again. Harper's team had confirmed everything. The shell company was indeed linked to Lorne's network. And more importantly, other families, mothers mostly, had vanished in similar ways. Always after borrowing money, always when desperate. But now, with Lorne's operation dismantled, several women had been located. 2 had already been reunited with their families. Harper placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "If she's alive, we'll find her. If she's not, you still deserve the truth." Ethan nodded, eyes burning. Later that day, the family gathered. Dan listened silently as Ethan shared what they knew. When he finished, Dan whispered, "I never should have let her carry all that alone." "No one should," Ethan said softly. Ellie squeezed her father's hand. "We'll carry the rest together now." Dan looked up at his children, older, stronger, weathered, and managed a fragile smile. "Then we've already found a piece of her." Outside, the wind rustled the trees and the sun broke gently through the clouds. Somewhere, maybe near, maybe far, Julia Carson might still be watching, still protecting, still holding on. 2 weeks passed in a blur of waiting. The family moved through their days like ghosts, jumping at every phone call, every unexpected knock. Then on a Tuesday morning, as ordinary as the day Julia disappeared, Detective Harper called. "We found her," he said simply. Ethan dropped the phone. 3 hours later, they gathered at a small safe house on the outskirts of town. Harper met them outside, his face lined with emotion. "She's been in Sacramento all this time," he explained softly. "Living under an alias Lorne's people created, she worked in their document forgery division, kept isolated, monitored constantly. When the operation collapsed, she was afraid to come home, afraid they might still be watching her family." "Is she?" Dan couldn't finish the question. "She's tired," Harper said gently. "Thin. But she's alive. And she never stopped loving you." He opened the door. The woman who rose from the chair was both familiar and foreign. Julia, but with silver streaks in her dark hair, lines etched around her eyes, her once full figure now angular, sharp. But her eyes, those were unchanged, bright with tears and a decade of unspoken love. For one breathless moment, no one moved. Then Dan stepped forward, his cane forgotten, his arms reaching out to the woman he'd mourned for 10 years. "You came back," he whispered. Julia nodded, tears streaming freely now. "I never left," she said softly. "Not here." She pressed a hand to her heart. Ellie and Ethan moved as one, surrounding their parents in a circle of arms and tears and broken whispers. Later, there would be explanations. Stories of fear and sacrifice, of threats and impossible choices. Julia would tell them of nights spent staring at their photographs, of birthdays marked in silence, of the constant, aching hope of return. But in that moment, there were only 4 people, holding each other as if they might never let go again. Outside the safe house, Detective Harper watched through the window, then quietly turned away. Some reunions were too sacred for witnesses. As he walked to his car, he noticed how the clouds had parted, allowing sunlight to stream across the small yard, a perfect ending, or perhaps, he thought with a smile, a perfect beginning. If this story helped you understand the importance of staying vigilant and trusting your instincts, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us share more real-life experiences that could one day save lives.